perhaps in defiance of the reality of the current consumer food marketplace, the stage is crowded with Kernza participants and collaborators. We are beginning to crowd our way into the marketplace. To echo Özlem only in this one part, I wouldn't dare otherwise, but we may indeed be making history with a perennial grain making its way into market, but we are not doing it entirely on terms of our own choosing. The consumer food marketplace and the production ag marketplace greet perennial grains with a certain amount of baggage and some preconditions, as you can imagine. And we aren't doing it alone. We, the Land Institute, characteristic of the organization throughout its history, we have a lot of collaborations. The Land Institute brings a lot to the table, but we aren't a consumer food processing company. Shocker. So, so we have a number of great partners who have leapt into this really, milestone event of a perennial grain reaching the marketplace, the consumer marketplace. I'm going to introduce the folks on the panel for you. What we've asked them to do is to just provide this sort of overview of what have their experiences and the organizations that they represent. What have their experiences been with Kernza perennial grain as a harbinger of perennial grains? Because it's not all about Kernza. This is a big deal, but it's the tip of an even bigger deal with a lot of other crops in the pipeline from a lot of other places. So they'll talk a little bit about their experiences with Kernza in the marketplace for the organizations that they work for, and then talk a little bit about what they see in the next 5 years, maybe, in the marketplace ahead. It'd be very quick. It's a 45-minute panel. We'll try to save some room for questions at the end. So I'll introduce everyone very quickly and then come back to introduce their comments. First on the end, hopefully staying on the end and not on the ground, we have Dr. Lee DeHaan, as you know, with the Land Institute, and then Rachel Stroer, the Chief Operating Officer of the Land Institute, Jack Erisman, a farmer from Pana, Illinois, Fiene from Plovgh, which is spelled Plovgh, but pronounced Plow, if you would. Plovgh is a partner in kind of matchmaking Kernza producers and Kernza growers for the Land Institute, and then James Farag from Patagonia Provisions, which is a division of Patagonia. So after earning his PhD from the University of Minnesota, Lee DeHaan came to the Land Institute initially as a perennial wheat breeder. And then he had a little hobby with intermediate wheatgrass that for the last 15 years has blossomed into the Kernza perennial grain program at the Land Institute. And Lee has been leading the intermediate wheatgrass and Kernza perennial grain program at the Land Institute, and to some degree internationally in terms of the Land Institute's role and his role in that for almost 15 years now. So we got an overview of intermediate wheatgrass and Kernza research yesterday, but we've asked Lee today to talk a little bit about sort of the what does Kernza mean, and what is the context of Kernza in the overall mission of the Land Institute?
Thanks, Scott. When I go out and visit with people, I often get the question, so how's the Kernza rollout coming? And I have no clue what to say when they ask me that. And so I do what I've learned to do, which is if you don't like the question, try to figure out what's wrong with it. So I started by looking up that word rollout, and it had a root origin that I wasn't even aware of, which is it was rolling out new airplanes. So they literally rolled out the airplane from the hangar and showed it to the world when they came out with a new airplane. That's where we get the word rollout, and it's now used for everything. It has a rollout. But it occurred to me that with Kernza, we are not rolling out a new product like a new iPhone. We are creating the aviation industry. So this is the very beginning of a totally new thing. It's not a slight tweaking or just a new product hitting the market that we expect it to roll out over the next 18 months. Now we are on a long-term trajectory of creating something totally new. Wes, when I first was here, was talking a lot about the comparison to Kitty Hawk and where the Land Institute was relative to the creation of airplanes. And so that kind of got me thinking about that, and I actually looked up some of the history of aviation, starting with Orville and Wilbur, great quote, which helps us to think about how much we should consider planning for the future. He said that, Wilbur Wright said, I confessed in 1901, I said to my brother Orville that man would not fly for 50 years. Ever since, I have distrusted myself and all predictions. So, I think that's kind of what I'm up against when people say, well, what's going to happen in the next 5 years? So it was 1903 was the first flight, and this is 1901. He said it wouldn't happen for at least 50 years, and I think I've led the charge being similarly pessimistic. So I think I'm in good company there. So how long did it take from 1903 to get to sort of modern aviation? The first commercial flight was in Tampa, across Tampa Bay. That was in 1914, so 11 years after the first flight. That was one guy flying one passenger across Tampa Bay, and it lasted for only 4 years. It wasn't viable. We didn't have commercial flights being really viable until 1925, which was the Ford Trimotor was invented, which was a plane that could carry enough people that it became viable commercial aviation. So here we are 22 years after the first flight. First transcontinental flight was in 1938, 35 years after the first flight. And really, if we want to look at success, which is what sometimes people are asking me, well, how long is it until Kernza becomes just like our annual grain crop? So in 1958, one half of transatlantic passengers were flying by air rather than taking ships. And it's not surprising that at that time, a first-class ticket by a boat cost exactly the same amount as an air ticket. So that was basically the break-even point. And after that, it was only a few years before basically airplanes took over all transatlantic passengers. So that was 55 years after the first flight to sort of success of air. I'm not totally comfortable using this sort of industrial analogy for our work, but it does help me to think about where we are in terms of not just rolling out a new product, but creating something very much from the scratch. And if I think about where was Kitty Hawk for us, for me personally, it was 2010, Charlie Melander's farm, 5 miles south of here, Assyria, Kansas. We had about 30 acres planted on his farm, and he harvested it with a normal combine. We got a whole semi-load of grain. We hauled it out to a mill in western Kansas, milled it up, and started putting it into the things and trying it. So, that was like the first flight for me. It was a goosebumps moment where we looked, wow, we can actually get something to grow. The yields were low. We see all the problems. It was not much better than the Wright Flyer of 1903, but it showed the promise and where we can go. So the first commercial flight took 11 years for them. It was only 2 years later that Birchwood Cafe started selling products on their menu in Minneapolis, Minnesota with Kernza in them. Kernza waffles was 2 years later. So now we're way ahead of schedule. It was permanently on their menu in 2013. In 2015, we had sustained sales all the time at Birchwood Cafe. 2016 was Long Root Ale was the first product that was actually packaged and sold. So we're only 6 years in. Maybe 2018, we'll look at a product coming out maybe from General Mills, more of a national scale product from a very conventional company. Question is, how long till we get to be similar to wheat? And I think that 55-year time frame is really actually pretty reasonable. So in order for the price to be the same as wheat, the yields are going to have to be quite similar to wheat. And I think we're looking at 50 years from now or so to hit that target. So it wouldn't be that much different than the development of aviation. So we're not talking about rolling out just one new product, but creating a whole industry from the beginning. But in terms of making these predictions, I think we've made mistakes on being overly pessimistic, and those are always the quotes that get quoted. But there's plenty of quotes the other way. I like to point this one out. Arthur Sommerfeld, the U.S. Postmaster General in 1959, said, "Before man reaches the moon, your mail will be delivered within hours from New York to Australia by guided missiles. We stand on the threshold of rocket mail." So this is totally believable. And so we see that we can be pessimistic or we can be overly optimistic. Either way, but I think the goal of someday being right up there with other crops is totally believable, but it's gonna take some time.
Thanks, Lee. Next, we're going to hear from Jack Erisman from Goldmine Farms near Pana, Illinois. And Jack, Lee mentioned the Birchwood Cafe in Minnesota, and it was Kernza from Jack's farm that was the first Kernza that made its way to Birchwood to be put in products on their menu. So Jack's going to talk a little bit about that experience and kind of as an early producer in that supply chain, and then also I think has some experience with long-time organic farmer, looking for all the progressive best ideas that are ecologically sound from a production perspective. And so this notion of what do perennial crops mean in a kind of beyond no-till regime for a production grain farmer. Jack?
You just gave my speech.
Yeah. Check's in the mail, right?
Yeah. Let's follow the continuum of the airline. Who was the first person to jump out of a plane and survive? And when? Well, it was an accident of circumstance. I'm sure. I'm always looking for new things. I've always been an experimenter on the farm. And that's the joy of doing it, learning things and finding out. And coming here is one of the real highlights of my life, and being able to be on this podium is rather unusual, but I'm pleased to have been invited by Fred, whom I happen to sit on a board with, so it's who you know, it's not what you know. And they were looking for some sucker to plant this new crop, and they found him. So I planted 9 acres in the fall of 2011, I think. Yeah, Lee sent me 100 pounds of seed. Yeah, that was right. And so we cultivated this little patch of ground that was difficult to till with 36-foot equipment, that kind of thing, and it was oblong, and so, yeah, let's put it into permaculture. And this is great because organic farmers are always getting hammered for tillage. You know, we're breaking down the soil structure. We're not giving the microbes a chance to rebuild. You know, what we need is more grass, and then grass presents its own kind of a problem when you try to go through rotations. You know. So that's a whole different story, and involves all kinds of technique. I'll bring you up to date. We still have that growth. And Lee tells me 2 years ago, well, last year I think it was, he says, well, you're probably not going to get a very good yield. And I said, well, why not? I thought I planted a permaculture. I'm excited about it. I don't have to till it. All I have to do is, well, it's becoming root bound. And he was right. It's becoming root bound. That's a problem. So it's almost like, if you want to compare it to something that we work with plants on the farm, it's a little bit like alfalfa and autotoxicity, although it's not the same biologically, because it's the root system. And I will tell you, if you try to put a spade in that ground, you damn well better be heavy. Because it's really tight. It's really tight. Some of you may have gone out and done the old biological test. You put a tighty-dighty, you dig a slit in the ground and put this white cotton in the ground to see what kind of biological activity you have. And after 6 or 8 weeks, hopefully you've gotten some moisture. And if it comes up and it's just in total tatters, you've got pretty good biological activity. Not too bad. And you're pleased with what you have. I did that this last summer in this, this 9 acres. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was just Hanes briefs. Brand new ones. The ground was so tight I couldn't get the slit as deep as I wanted, If you dug the slit deep enough, then you would have exposed so much root mass that you destroyed the opportunity for the microbes to really do what they wanted to do. Response being, or the analysis being, we think, too dry and too tight. There's nothing there. They were a lot deeper. So those are some of the things we've learned. We did a new planting with a later generation last fall, did another 18 acres. And the first year is never very successful. The first year on the 9 acres, we baled for hay, but it was a dry year. And it made more as a hay crop. And we had a lot of volunteer red clover in it. The second year, the 13 crop and the 14th crop were both harvested. They were reasonable, didn't make a lot. I think we're between the 250-pound range yield per acre. I sent you all those figures. I don't have them anymore. But all of that was donated to the University of Minnesota to see how we could hull and use this grain and mill this grain and see where it would fit. So long story short, and to be somewhat brief, I've never received a dime for a pound of Kernza.
Thank you, Jack. Next, we'll hear from Brianna Fiene, who is a market manager for Plovgh. And Plovgh is they're based in Wisconsin, and they are a source, a matchmaker, but in a way, but a source for food and feed grade perennial grains, rotationally grown crops, and emerging new varieties. So they sort of are specialized to take on the challenges and to find and to kind of match producers and growers for these crops. Brianna grew up on a farm and has worked other places on the coast, right, West Coast, and is still based in Wisconsin.
Thanks. I've been asked to speak about the supply. Okay, I'm sorry. I have a little bit of a lisp, so bear with me. Supply and demand and market development for Kernza and what that looks like for Plovgh. On the supply side, we do a lot of organization with farmers and farms to kind of create a diverse farming contingent to grow Kernza and ramp up production. On the demand side, we tiptoe this balance between fulfilling demand and, doing some prototyping in the marketplace so that people can get their Kernza and start experimenting with it and get really excited about it, and then hopefully, fulfilling orders for Kernza, but not over-promising. Because at this point, we really need to ramp up production. I'm happy to say that demand does outweigh production of Kernza at this point. So I would say that is a success in a way, but really what we're trying to do is bridge the two, the supply and demand side, and have them develop in cohesion and kind of at the same time instead of being upside down in one or the other. Because both sides take on risk, and in the last 2 years, I think we've gotten a lot better at understanding those risks and mitigating those risks through creating a diversified supply base and a diversified marketplace. I was asked to address what do customers think about Kernza, and this is the most fun part. So I'll start with beer. Patagonia's long root ale, I would say is super successful. I've only heard great things. People love it. I'm constantly asked where you can buy it in the Midwest, and unfortunately it's not there yet, but hopefully in the future you'll see it in your local gas station beer selection case. Bakers really like it. I've, experimenting with different percentages of Kernza in bread is now the new most fun pastime of a lot of bakers across the country. Our national pancake purveyor, Amy Halloran, yesterday gave our 100% Kernza pancakes her stamp of approval. So lots of good customer feedback for sure. I have heard on the malting side it is a little high in protein, and the hulls are a little too big to really successfully malt, but on the flip side of that, brewers have had a ton of success with Kernza. So yeah, I feel incredibly encouraged by that. And while we are not quite there in the grain production realm, so not everybody can place an order and get their Kernza delivered to their front doorstep in a week like they're used to. And that's really frustrating for businesses, I've found. I think the key here is communication, communicating why this is such a unique and special crop and why it is so important. And why it is so important to be persistent and supportive, but also patient as we kind of work through the challenges that processing has presented. And in the next couple years, in collaboration with the Land Institute, universities, farmers like Jack, and Plovgh, keeping close track of data sets and just working as sort of an extension agent, I hope that best growing practices and on-farm agronomics start to become more clear. And on the supply side, or on the demand side, I'm really hoping to suss out the challenges that we face with processing so that everything is smooth and automatic. So that's all I've got to say about Kernza. Thank you.
Actually, really quickly. Sorry, I just jumped on you. Can you talk just specifically about the challenges with processing? What are the specific challenges that folks have with the grain?
Okay, admittedly not my favorite thing to talk about. Right now, there are probably 3 different genetics out there, C3, C4, C5, I believe, in rotation. I would say the discouraging side is that there's a lot of hull and a small germ, which processors are not used to seeing, wheat processors. But there are a lot of different avenues that we are taking with this. Recently, teff has come up as something that we could model this processing after, or rice. And being in Wisconsin, there's a lot of wild rice growers in Minnesota. So there are options. It's just shifting these mindsets between this is not a commodity wheat and this will not probably ever be moved along the supply chain like a commodity wheat. The encouraging thing is that what I'm hearing from feedback from processors that we send Kernza to is that they see a real difference in genetics. The C5 genetics, the germ seems to be substantially bigger to the point where it will be much easier to process. And I know that Lee is working hard on this, and Jim Anderson and University of Minnesota and UW and Cornell and just so many great minds are behind this. And so I really think that we're on the cusp of figuring it all out.
Thank you, Bree. Thanks for taking that one on.
Yeah, it's
okay. Next, we'll hear from James Farag, who is a senior manager for product at Patagonia Provisions. Patagonia is a division. Patagonia Provisions is a division of Patagonia, correct?
That's correct.
And seeks to source and market foods produced in ways that regenerate and restore shared resources rather than deplete them. So the focus of their food production is to model products made from sustainable regenerative practices. And they seek to partner with producers who have that same point of view and who produce products that meet those standards. As Lee mentioned, Patagonia was the first company to develop a commercial retail product and take it to the marketplace with Kernza Perennial grain, and that harbinger was long root ale. So we'll hear from James.
Thank you, Scott. So Patagonia, as most of you probably know, is for the last 40 years has primarily been an apparel company with a strong environmental focus. So much so that we like to think of ourselves sometimes as an environmental activist company, masquerading as an apparel company. And food has always been a passion of our founder, Yvonne. And over the last few years, well, for a long time, he wanted to get into the food business because he felt like he could have an even stronger environmental impact through food. Because part of Patagonia's mission is do the least amount of harm possible. And with apparel, that's that makes sense. Though with food, Yvonne felt he had the opportunity to not only do the least amount of harm, but to actually have a positive impact, have a net positive impact. So not only not doing harm, but doing good. And it was through Yvonne's relationship with Wes that we came to learn about Kernza. And my director, Birgit, tells the story that when she started with provisions, Yvonne walked up to her desk and dropped a bag of Kernza on her desk and said, "Do something with that." and so Birgit approached the Land Institute and Lee DeHaan about 4 or 5 years ago. And at that time, we were told that it was still in development. It's not ready for commercial use. There's still a lot of work to go. It's kind of that typical, business versus researcher kind of, tug of war. It's like, it's not ready yet. We need to study it more. And business is like, no, let's do it. And so, Birgit said, let's.
Another 50 years.
Another 50 years. Lee said another 50 years. And Birgit said, I think we should get this in the ground and test it. And so, with Lee's help, we identified some growers in northern Minnesota who are grass growers, a lot of experience growing perennial ryegrass, and partnered with them, contracted with them to grow Kernza on our behalf. And it being a new untested crop, we made special arrangements with them that we would basically guarantee, because it was kind of unknown what the yield would be and the growing practices and such, or the results rather. Guarantee them a certain figure per acre in order to grow it, so we could test and actually, ensure that they would, it would be worth their while to take on this journey with us. And so that was 3. So, and they were conventional farmers, and we asked that we required that they would grow it organically, because that's very important to Patagonia, obviously. And so they. Planted organically, began farming organically, and so it was a transitional field from conventional. And so this year actually is 3 years. So in order to, as many of you may know, convert from conventional to organic, it's a 3-year process to be certified. So the Kernza that we've harvested over the last 3 years has not been certified organic, though it was grown to organic standards. This year's crop is the first one that is certified organic, so that's very exciting. And so, let's see. So that was kind of the initial supply side of trying to figure out how to make sure we had some Kernza to work with, and then what are we going to do with it? How are we going to tell that story? And so there's a big education piece that kind of goes along with that. As far as letting the customers know, why is this in our product? Why is this important? Why are you using this? And we thought, what better way to tell that story than with a beer? And so, so we came out with Long Root Ale. It uses 15% Kernza as part of the grain bill. And we partnered with a brewery in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon, to brew. They're an organic brewery, a certified B Corp. So they've been an excellent partner. And so we made this delicious beer. We've been distributing it on the West Coast. Beer distribution is a little bit challenging. You have to work within certain parameters. So although we would love to have it available here and all across the country, we're working within the distribution channel available with the partner brewery. So right now it's available only on the West Coast. And we feel like one possible path forward that we're looking at is partnering with other regional breweries around the country to kind of take that model and replicate it and use regional ingredients, regional resources. So maybe one on the East Coast, maybe one in the Midwest here, in hopes that we can get Kernza beer to everyone who would like it. The response so far has been wonderful. People are really happy with the beer. The main complaint is, where can I get it? Why can't I get it yet? Let's see.
Several of us on staff have become experts at smuggling Long Root Ale.
Yeah, I've had multiple requests to ship it.
I'm not going to say any names, Tim Cruz, but we've gotten specific instructions on how to get it through baggage claim. From no names, Tim Cruz. I have in this kind of flight metaphor, just a quick question, either with regard to Kernza, but more really perennial grains as a whole, and Patagonia's vision for its engagement with the food marketplace, which is big and diverse and challenging, I'm sure. What is the Kitty Hawk? Yeah. With regard to, from your perspective, for perennial grains to find products and find a market in the food marketplace?
Well, I mean, so like I said, the beer is kind of our first, foray out, just because it's a good conversation starter, right? People can talk about it. But we have plans, and we're currently working on incorporating Kernza into other food products. I can't tell you exactly which ones, but we have a number in the works right now. So hopefully within the next year or two, you'll see Kernza in other products. But to that point, we're also looking at other perennial projects. So like the silphium oil is one that's really interesting. That's kind of next, at least from talks I've had with folks at the Land Institute, that's kind of like next on deck as being ready for commercialization. And so for us, it's really important to kind of come at our product development through that lens of coming from an ingredient centric standpoint first. So like what is the impact that this ingredient's having on the soil, on the land, and how can we incorporate that into a product and then take that to market and share it and share that story. And part of Patagonia's mission is to use business to inspire solutions to the global environmental crisis. So even though we're a small company, I'm sorry. I actually specifically earlier said, make sure you turn your ringer off. And when I did that, I must have flipped it the other way. So I apologize.
Oil's ready.
Right? That's the call. But to use business to inspire solutions to the global environmental crisis. And so we see this as an opportunity to have an impact on folks like General Mills, who, have a much larger footprint, much larger impact in the food supply chain than Patagonia Provisions does at this point. So we find that very encouraging that someone like us can come to market and start that conversation and kind of help it along and hopefully help shine a light and pave a pathway for other folks who are interested in following that path as well.
Thank you, James. Thanks very much. You may remember that yesterday, I think Tim mentioned the biculture that's being developed in partnership with Patagonia. So there'll be the first commercially produced Kernza grown out of a biculture. So there'll be a legume, I think alfalfa, that would be grown in a biculture with Kernza to sort of begin analyzing the fertility data and then the fertility narrative when fertility is built into the system. And you will want to know that I don't know where all those plots are, but one of them is at the Perennial Agriculture Project outside of Lawrence, and it's been affectionately named already Little Patagonia. That little plot. So next we have Rachel Stroer, who is as you know, is the Chief Operations Officer for the Land Institute and plays a role in a number of, in fact, most of the things that are happening at the Land Institute. And we asked Rachel to be a part of this discussion, specifically to talk about these partnerships are emerging and they're diverse. You can see there are different scales. It's international to some degree, certainly national in many respects. And so the question that we're throwing out for Rachel to help us with is, what do these partnerships mean in the coming years for the Land Institute? Again, our clear transparency, we're not a food processing company. But we are working on food products that will become food. So, Rachel, we'll hear from you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think it's appropriate that this Kernza commercialization started as a farm-to-table thing. Jack providing the Birchwood Cafe with a small supply for them to mix in a little percentage into their pancakes and waffles. And then Patagonia as sort of the next level is great because it's this sort of maverick hyper-environmentalist corporation, and so that's perfect and appropriate. But as you know, our vision for Kernza and all of our grains is even bigger than that. And so I think it's great that there's a sort of market signal from General Mills that there's more beyond that. I want to talk about how these things, this activity, reflects back to the Land Institute itself. On one hand, this provides a public face to the reality that this idea of perennial polycultures is no longer a pipe dream, it's a reality. The scientists have proven that, and they've published on that, but most people can't read and understand what they've said in those publications. And so this is sort of a market way of saying this is happening, and it's biologically possible and a real thing. The second way that it comes back to the Land Institute is that it brings awareness to this organization. We are a nonprofit organization, research organization that still raises almost over 90% of our annual operating budget every year. So all of these beer drinkers now know about us, and hopefully they know that we need their money too. So those are the two main benefits, and then I'm going to keep it short because we're almost out of time. But the last thing that I want to point out is that I think the way that we spend resources as an organization is a good symbol of where our focus is. And we have a limited pie. And so there's this effort to sort of pre-commercialize, as we sometimes like to say, Kernza. And we do spend some of our resources on that. But I think to the extent that that pie remains limited, this organization will continue to steward that effort, but like I said before, our vision is much bigger, and so we will continue to focus our dollars at the research that will create a grain and grains and a polyculture with enough yield to cover millions of acres rather than, 250 maybe? 300 today of Kernza. So that is really our focus as an organization, while stewarding and making sure that these first few airplanes don't crash, thus leaving the public totally unwilling to get on.
Thank you. So I think in order, so that we, out of respect for the schedule of the day and for other guests, I think we're gonna move on. But I'll remind you, James, Brianna, Jack, Rachel, and Lee. If you can find them, I mean, you know how this works. Most of you have probably been here before, but we'll all be here. We'll all be hanging around. So don't hesitate to come up and ask questions if you'd like. And you can always send questions into the info@landinstitute.org, and we can pass those on and answer them. But I have to move on so that we... Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Scott. Thank you. That's what I'm going by today, so we'll go with that. If not, Tim Cruz is my name. So let's have one more round of applause for our partners and guests.